Good morning. We're beginning our Revelation Bible study on Revelation chapter 14. We'll begin by reading the chapter. Hopefully, you have a paper Bible available. Here goes. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." "Yes," says the Spirit, "they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and the blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia. This is the word of our God. Revelation chapter 14. As you see on the screen, today we are considering visions 4, 5, and 6, and really the introductory portion of that. You saw in this chapter the angels flying in midair, calling to one another. And so in the visions that we have here in Revelation 14, the Lamb, the 144,000, three angels, and the harvest. Kind of where we are in the whole flow of the book of Revelation. We cover all three visions here, visions 4, 5, and 6 out of the 7 visions that began back in chapter 12 with the woman clothed with the sun. Then we had the beast from the sea, beast from the earth. Then we had the 3 that we're looking at today. And then next time we'll get into the 7 angels with the 7 vials. All right. How do you make it through a scary scene in a movie? Do you cover your eyes, hold on tightly to a loved one, fast forward through the scene? Um, you just remember that in the end, the good guy always wins. That's also true here in the book of Revelation. In the last lesson, we saw how the enemies of the church, the dragon, the which was Satan, the beast from the sea, the evil governments, the beast from the earth, the Antichrist, they gang up on God's people. The scenes described back in Revelation 12 and 13 were pretty frightening. But in today's lesson, we have a flash forward to Judgment Day when we see that God's people will still ultimately triumph. This section today, especially, gives us confidence that when the war with the enemies of the church gets tough, we still can be certain that through the blood of the Lamb, we Christians will prevail. That movie clip, or that was a trailer from Lord of the Rings, which is an entirely different topic. I'm not the scholar of the Lord of the Rings. I don't know that I've actually finished all of the books of Lord of the Rings, but apparently it's an allegory that Tolkien wrote regarding the Christian church, and you can definitely pick up on those themes even if you have a cursory understanding of Christianity, and fast forward to the end. So we just had some of these scary scenes in Revelation: beast from the earth, beast from the sea, the dragon and the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, and people rejoicing. How do we make it through these scary scenes? And maybe you think for yourself, how do we make it through these scary times? When it looks like the beast from the sea, beast of the earth are rallying together, and it looks like God's people are being pursued on every continent of this world. Well, you fast forward to the end. The image that we have here on the page, who is the lamb that we had back in Revelation 14, verse 1? That one's fairly simple. The lamb is Jesus, Jesus Christ. In Revelation 14, verse 1, then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their heads. We already had that back in Revelation chapter 5. If you want to flip back there, feel free. Who are the four living creatures? Verse 3. And they sang a new song before the throne and the elders. And before the, talking about these who are 144,000. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. The four living creatures are cherubs, cherubim, or seraphs, or seraphim, angels, God's honor guard, really. They are right there before the throne of God. The elders, verse 3, they sang a new song before the throne and the four living creatures and the elders. We've had these guys before, representatives of the Old and New Testament church, 24 of them, 12 and 12, representing the number of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Revelation chapter 4, verse 4 had said this: surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. The 144,000, who are they? That is the question. We're talking about the number of God's elect. They were sealed with the name of the Lamb and the Father on their foreheads, verse 1. 144,000, verse 1. 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. That identifies them. And obviously, we're dealing with a figurative number here. We aren't dealing with a literal number of literally only 144,000. And the rest of the vision makes that apparent, because the rest of the vision is also similar details that are apocalyptic in fashion or in nature. And the number has some pretty simple math to it. This is a good illustration of the truth from John 5, verse 23, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. We only come to the Father through Jesus Christ, the Lamb, who is also the way and the truth and the life. And we've covered that number before, 12 being the number of God's church, 12 often referring to the Old Testament church, and then 12 to the New Testament church, like 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 disciples, times 10 times 10 times 10 is a full and complete number of the Old Testament and New Testament church. Pretty straightforward. Mount Zion, then I looked in there before me. This is still in verse 1. There was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion, where the temple once stood, is the place where Jesus gathers his people, the church on earth and then in heaven. Some Lutheran commentators are divided on what exactly Mount Zion is, if you want to nail down a specific. Some say that it represents the invisible church, and there would be some backup for that in Hebrews 12. But we already have a picture of the invisible church, all believers of all time, in the 144,000. And Mount Zion is the place where the Lamb and the church meet. Dr. Sigbert Becker, in his discussion and commentary in his lectures on Revelation, he takes Mount Zion to be the heavenly Jerusalem that John later saw coming down out of heaven, Revelation chapter 21. And in this sense, Mount Zion would be the church triumphant. And there's a couple references here from Isaiah 25, 6 through 9, Isaiah 11, 9 through 12, Hebrews 12, and you can look those up on your own, because what we're really talking about there is the place where God meets his people in glory and in triumph. And the interesting thing, back in chapter 7, there were 144,000 there. There are still 144,000 here. Not one of the elect can be lost. At least noteworthy, that here's the comfort from our God, that our God knows those who are his and holds on to those who are his. What are they doing here in Revelation chapter 14? And verses 2 and 3, and I heard the sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Why is this a new song? Well, it's the song of salvation, the truths that are new every morning. Consider Psalm 96, verses 1 and 2. We'll look at this ever so briefly. Back in the book of Psalms, here we are. Psalm 96, verses 1 and 2. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name. Here we go. Proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations and his marvelous deeds among all peoples. And the entire Psalm 96 would be worth a moment of your time. Maybe, this evening before you lay down to go to sleep at night, or even right now. Psalm 96, talking about all the glory that is declared about God in this song, and that this song, or the content of this song, is proclaiming the salvation of our God. And so when we have this picture in Revelation chapter 14 of a new song, they are proclaiming the salvation of our God. And the reason it is new is because these truths are new every day. They don't grow old. And perhaps you think of 1 Corinthians 12, verse 3. No one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. So only Christians can sing this song. Obviously any person, and every person will kneel before Jesus and bow before him at the end of time. Some people may be able to describe the historical reality of Jesus Christ, or they may be able to provide a literary analysis of the Bible, but it takes faith to understand and to comprehend and to worship Jesus, because that's what this song really is. This song is a worship song. It's not just regurgitating of mere historical facts. It is praising Jesus for his salvation. And so only Christians can sing this song. Verse 3, No one could learn this song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. That, yes, Christians, you have a unique song that is uniquely yours. And only, and this is the other part, only when believers get to heaven will we fully understand the blessings that God has in store for us. Consider 1 Corinthians 13, that great, the chapter about love. Talk about Christian love. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And so now our understanding and our comprehension of these blessings and of all that awaits us in heaven is only in part. But God has, it's going to have to wait until we get to heaven to see fully all the blessings that God has in store for us. What about that part? The 144,000 are described in verse 4. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. What? Talking spiritually here, that spiritually the motif or the idea of adultery and idolatry are kind of used as images for one another and often linked. And so if somebody commits spiritual adultery, that is idolatry. And so these 144,000 have been faithful to Christ alone. And our relationship with God is often described as a marriage throughout many of the parables of Jesus. And I think we looked at this one other time, talking about all the way back to Genesis 3, Genesis 2 and 3, where God had created marriage and God walked in communion with his people. Fast forward to the New Testament, and you've got Ephesians 5, where Paul describes Jesus as washing the church and making her radiant and pure and taking her as his bride. What is it in Isaiah 60 or 61, maybe 62, talking about being arrayed in garments of salvation and being clothed in wedding clothes. Our relationship with God is often described as a marriage. And spiritual unfaithfulness or idolatry is often called adultery. You see this a lot even through a lot of the Old Testament prophets, especially the minor prophets. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2, the example here. I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. Talking about our relationship to Jesus as that of a marriage relationship. Christ and his church, another wood carving. Notice the crown that Jesus wears in this picture. Revelation 4, verses 6 through 13 is the center part of this chapter, and it's the second of the three visions. And we've got these three angels, and they look terrifying. So, how do we know that this section is a flashback? This happens a few times throughout the book of Revelation. That we've had the fast forward to the end of time, and now we've got a flashback to what had happened previously. I'll change my notes here. How do we know that this section is a flashback? Verse 12 says that the saints must patiently endure until judgment comes. Look at verse 12. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Verses 1 through 5, John already had a vision of the church triumphant. It's another reminder that this book is not chronological from beginning to end, as though the beginning, Revelation 1, 2, 3, 4 starts at one place in time and progresses in a linear fashion until the end of Revelation 22, at the end of time. That's not how Revelation is written. There is a little bit of jumping around in time and chronology, and that's okay, because Revelation even describes how that happens. Verse 12, this calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints. Verses 1 through 5, we already had an image of the church triumphant in heaven. And also, as we kind of go through the cycle of visions that that they often begin with judgment, or they begin with the ascension of Jesus and progress to Judgment Day and beyond Judgment Day. What do you think? There's this angel, Revelation 14, verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. Revelation 14, verse 6 was Martin Luther's funeral text. That, when Martin Luther died, the Revelation 14, verse 6 was what they preached on at his funeral, and said, Martin Luther is an angel, this eternal gospel proclaiming. Well, it is true that the angel, or the messenger with the eternal gospel, illustrates the truth that God's word will be preached to all nations until the very end. So therefore, for this reason, the angel represents anyone who faithfully preaches the word. And yes, that includes Martin Luther, but it's not exclusively Martin Luther. Excuse me. Consider Matthew 24, verses 14 and 35. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That's the first angel proclaiming, saying in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." First angel, come and gone. And that, yes, includes Martin Luther. The second angel, verse 8. A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." What downfall does she announce? Well, Babylon the Great, plain and simple, enemies of God and his people. Why is Babylon used as a name for the enemies of the church? Because Babylon was the enemy of Israel in the Old Testament, and we're picking up on a lot of that Old Testament imagery throughout this section, and yes, throughout all of Revelation, talking about the enemies of God and his people have fallen and been destroyed. Revelation 14, verse 10. If you're looking at the screen, here's the Greek for today. Kai otas pietai ek tu oinu tu thimu tu theu tu kekuras manu akratu ento poterio tes orges. Or Revelation 14, verse 10. He too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He'll be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lord. Talking about the cup of God's wrath. What is the wine and what is the cup? The judgment that God has decreed. There shouldn't be a question mark there. Believer is going to look forward. Verses Revelation 14, verses 12 and 13. We need to look at this first. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," says the Spirit, "they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." And so there's this patient endurance on behalf of the saints. But that, yes, a believer can look forward to that day when we have rest from our labors. Until then, we look, and we ask God for this patient endurance to carry out our labors as they are needed. You can also consider Isaiah 57, verses 1 and 2 as on your screen. "The righteous perish, and no one ponders it in his heart. Devout men are taken away, and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil. Those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death." So there's rest from the fight against the devil, the world, our sinful flesh, rest from being pursued and persecuted by the unbelieving world, rest from temptation, all of those things. What does it mean that the deeds of the believers will follow them? Yes, this is the second half of verse 13. "Yes," says the Spirit, They will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. Well, on Judgment Day, Jesus will point to the good deeds of the believers as evidence of their faith in him. We have that also in Matthew 25. When we've got the separation of the sheep and the goats, Jesus separates them first, and then he talks to each group on the basis of what they did or what they didn't do. That the separation is based on faith, but then on the day of judgment, that he points to their deeds as evidence of their faith or their lack thereof. And this really gets even into the discussion that's on the screen, reconciling James 2, verse 24 with Romans 3, verse 28. James 2, verse 24, you see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Romans 3, verse 28, for me, we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. How do you reconcile those two? And it definitely comes into play in relation to what we see here in Revelation chapter 14, that the deeds of the believers will follow them. Well, Paul and James don't face against each other with swords crossed like antagonists, like James is saying one thing and Paul is saying another, but they stand like back to back, defending against different attacks on the doctrine of salvation. Paul and James are complementary, not contradictory. Paul looks at the root of faith, that is grace, while James looks at the fruit of faith, that is works. James and Paul would have been both happy to say, we are saved by faith alone, but faith alone, or faith is never alone. Kind of the image of grace at the root and faith, and then works are the fruit that we have on the screen. Revelation 14, verses 14 through 20, the last of the three visions here of Revelation chapter 14, the harvest of the earth. Explain this harvest imagery. Yeah, what is going on here? Well, it's been numerous times throughout Scripture that we have the image of a harvest at the end of time. The time is coming when both the fruits of good and evil must be harvested. The time is coming to an end. And that we see that the God of patient love is also a God of justice. It's not that God hasn't given time for sinners, pictured as grapes in this section, to repent. He has been patient, just as Jesus explained in the parable of the fig tree. Look back at Luke 13, verses 6 through 9, talking about the fig tree that hasn't produced fruit. And the gardener says, well, just give me one more year. I'll dig around it, I'll water it, I'll fertilize it. And if it produces fruit the next year, fine. And if it doesn't, okay, then cut it down. God is patient, but he's also a God of justice. So we started today's lesson by asking how you make it through a scary movie scene. A couple of things you might do: maybe close your eyes, fast forward through the scary parts, hold on to someone you love, or remember that the hero will win. And over again, we remember the hero will win. Jesus wins. As the rest of the world is running and screaming and crying out in terror to the mountains, fall on us, and to the valley, to the hills, hide us, to the valleys, hide us. We have nothing to fear. And that kind of gets us into the last section, which kind of, well, I guess will lead us into Revelation chapter 15 and following, talking about Armageddon. That's going to be coming up here in the next week or two. But suffice to say, how are we to get through? How are we to face these last days when it looks like the beasts of the earth, the beasts of the sea are winning, then the dragon is taking those and opposing those who stand for Jesus? Well, we watch for the return of the King. talking about the Lord of the Rings again. At the end of the Lord of the Rings, when that little group, that little band of, Frodo and all the hobbits or whoever it is, it's it's been a while since I've watched Lord of the Rings. Um, they're standing there and they're waiting, and it looks just at the moment when it looks like they're going to be overwhelmed. Then Gandalf returns with all those saints, I guess, is the biblical correlation there. um, then the king returns with his victory, and the victory is going to be utter and complete and swift. And so you and I have nothing to fear because Jesus wins. Next time we'll get into the seventh vision, Revelation chapter 15. Thanks so much for joining us here today. God bless your day.